Welcome to the Historic District and the Lucas National Historic District and National Iron and Steel Heritage Museum. I'm Scott Houston, the president, and we're very excited tonight to have a continuation of our lecture series. Jerry Althoff is here to talk to us about the Battle of Lake Erie. And I do want to get into a little bit about Jerry's career. But, it was interesting to how to connect the Battle of Lake Erie and Lucans and all of this. So I think we'll start in the beginning, in Genesis. No, we'll skip ahead. We'll skip ahead a little bit. But it's interesting, George Washington and the Washington family were part interest owners in the Principio furnace up here at the head of the Elk in Maryland, I believe. And, George was also the guy who sparked a world war in, the French and Indian in war, which is interesting. And he had traveled up through Pittsburgh, the site of former steelmaking town that it became, and ended up in the failed negotiations with the French and the war. And ultimately, the English defeat the French and Indians and do not get hemmed in on the West and are able to become a nation through the next war, the American Revolution. They separate from England, and then that independence is tested in the War of 1812 as the British try and hem in the colonies on the West. But it's very interesting, you get the iron and steel story that I believe in the War of 1812 is that it allows westward expansion and ultimately, the great United States and the natural resources that are up in that area and in specific to iron and steel and the towns of around Chicago and, of course, the Mesabi Range and the iron ore thing. So it's very interesting how, this battle and how it plays into the pivotal War of 1812 will be very interesting to hear. But, you hear about, George Washington, the French and Indian, and how they tried to hem in the English, and then to pay for that, we had, the English wanted to tax everybody, and we didn't like that so much without representation. So very interesting, and then the subsequent battle as we were trying to defend our independence. But Jerry is born in Gettysburg and served 4 years in the Coast Guard with time spent in a tour of Vietnam. And I don't think that was a friendly tour. But attended Dixie College in St. George, Utah, and then was National Park Service Ranger for a number of years, beginning in 1972 at the Mount Zion, or it's Zion National Park, and for a couple of years, 3 years or so, before moving on to Theodore Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota and Perry's Victory Monument in Ohio. And historical papers and presentations, which is interesting. I want to highlight as well the American Society for the Advancement of African American Life in History Symposium in '93, underexplored aspects of African American military experience, which must be fascinating as well. And then the Great Lakes Maritime History Conference in 2000, the African American Military Experience Conference in 2000. So those must be interesting subjects, to hear as well about African American sailors and military experience. But published works, those are symposium published works of the Oliver Hazard Perry and Battle of Lake Erie, booklet that became a book in 1999. The Battle of Lake Erie, Kent State University book, in the book on the War in Great Lakes in 1991. Deep Water Sailors, Shallow Water Soldiers, Man the United States Fleet. And I believe I came across that in a reference somewhere, so that's very interesting. And then African Americans in the United States Navy, the War of 1812, in the Journal of Erie, 1994, and a signal victory, the Lake Erie Campaign, 1812 to 1813, and co-authored that book through the Naval Institute, 1997. And then lastly, the Battle of Lake Erie, a narrative in James M. Morris's Readings in American Military History, and that was published in 2003. And he retired from the National Park Service as a chief ranger and historian at Perry's Victory and International Peace Memorial in December of 2004, and he currently lives in Williamsburg, Virginia. So we are we're very happy to have Jerry Althoff here tonight to speak to us about the Battle of Lake Erie.
Great,
Thank you very
appreciate
much.
it. I would like to start out by thanking Scott and the museum staff for the opportunity to be here this evening. As he mentioned, I retired from the National Park Service about 9 years ago, and since that time I've not had enough opportunities to do this talk. So any day I get to talk about the Battle of Lake Erie is a good day for me. So I am genuinely glad to be here this evening. There's one thing I'm going to apologize. They say it's bad form to apologize before you start a program, but I found out my very high-tech laser pointer doesn't work on this screen. It just kind of eats its way right through it. So we're going to do this the old-fashioned way when I do it. I won't do it. So I've never used one of these before, so I don't know how well I can point on this or not. But one thing I do need to advise you about before we get started. Back when I did this program on a regular basis, I was criticized on occasion for being overly graphic in some of my descriptions of the Battle of Lake Erie. Guilty as charged, because we're talking about war. And for any of you who have actually seen The Elephant, you know that war is not bands playing and flags flying and long lines of soldiers marching on parade. War is mud and blood and fear and confusion and pain and misery and brutality and killing. And I see no reason whatsoever to put a silver lining on that. I used to give this program a lot for school groups, and the one thing I always tell them is we're talking about real people. These are men who died horrible deaths, endured terrible wounds, and lived with the pain of those wounds and the nightmare of their experiences for the remainder of their lives. And many of those lives were drastically shortened as a result of those experiences. So I tell it like it is. And as I say, because I did do this a lot for school groups. And one of the things I tried to let school groups know that there is no such thing as glory in war. I never wanted a school child to walk out of my program thinking that there's such a thing as glory. I mean, 30, 40 years after war, you get a bunch of veterans together at a dinner talking over old times. Among those shared experiences, you might find a modicum of something called glory. But there's certainly no such thing as glory in those pain-racked wards of veterans' hospitals. And I guarantee you there's no such thing as glory in those long rows of sorrowful white crosses in veteran cemeteries. So I tell it like it is for one reason, and it's not for the sake of imparting gratuitous violence. I tell it like it is to make sure that the sacrifices that were made by men such as this one will not be forgotten. So, Battle of Lake Erie. Now, I think it's fairly safe to say that the War of 1812 is one of the least known of all of America's wars. Pick up a history book. For the sake of argument, let's say a school textbook, and open at the War of 1812 section, assuming you can find a War of 1812 section. But again, for the sake of argument, let's say there is one. What are you going to read about? Well, you're going to read about the Battle of Lake Erie, the bombardment of Fort McHenry, the writing of the Star-Spangled Banner, or possibly the Battle of New Orleans. Now, you read about those engagements because the United States won those battles. But I'm willing to venture that very few of you sitting in this room tonight have heard of battles like Chateau Gay, Odelltown, La Colle Mill, Beekmantown, Chrysler's Farm, Stony Creek, St. David's, the Beaver Dams, Queenston Heights, Bladensburg, the River Raisin, Monguaga, Fort Mims, Fort Boyer, Fort Dearborn, Fort Michilimackinac, Fort Niagara, Fort Schlosser, Fort Detroit. You don't read about those battles because the United States lost those battles. In fact, the United States lost most of the battles of the War of 1812, and that's something our history books don't like to talk about. It's often said that the United States won every war it fought until Korea. That is not true. The United States did not win the War of 1812. Now, I'm not going to stand up here and go so far as to tell you we lost it, but I will categorically state we did not win it, and let me prove that to you. Now, this is a bit of an oversimplification, but here's one way to look at it. The primary military objective of the United States during the War of 1812 was to capture and annex Canada. The primary military objective of Great Britain was to preserve Canada as a British colony. Is Canada part of the United States? Who won the War of 1812? Now, we also know the United States is not an aggressor nation. We don't declare war on other nations, right? We don't invade other countries, right? Well, we'll save that one for another time. But it was the United States that declared war on Great Britain on June 18, 1812. And it was not a very bright thing for us to do. Now, brief comparison here. At the beginning of the War of 1812, Great Britain had an army of about 250,000 men. The United States Army comprised fewer than 7,000 men. The Royal Navy, the greatest navy in the world, bar none, more than 650 warships. Of that number, more than 100 were big two-decker 74-gun line of battleships. The United States had a grand total of 17 ocean-going warships, the largest of which were 3 44-gun frigates. And we declared war on them. What's the matter with this picture? It'd be like any one of you going up to the entire Philadelphia Eagles football team and saying, "Let's fight." Now, granted, it's only the Eagles, but still, it wouldn't be a very smart thing for you to do. But that's what the United States did. We declared war on the greatest military power on earth. So, how are we going to fight this war? We couldn't very well invade Great Britain. We didn't have the army. We didn't have the navy. But there, just to the north of us, sat Canada. And the United States had its eyes on Canada ever since the Revolutionary War. We tried to capture Canada unsuccessfully during that war. Now, population-wise, the United States outnumbered Canada by over 25 to 1. Very few British troops in Canada. Most of them are fighting the French over on the Iberian Peninsula. And for some strange reason, the Southern and Western politicians in Congress, collectively known as the War Hawks, secretly believed that Canada wanted to be part of the United States. Problem was, somebody forgot to tell the Canadians about that. But in any case, the cry in Congress became, "On to Canada." And we would invade Canada through 3 separate routes. First would be the route from the Revolutionary War, the traditional invasion route, north along Lake Champlain, up the Richelieu River, across the St. Lawrence, and capture Montreal, the capital of Canada. Second, cross the Niagara River, capture Fort George and Fort Erie, the British bastions on either end of that river. And then finally, right up here along western Lake Erie. The objective here, Fort Malden and the Amherstburg Navy Yard, the major British base on Lake Erie. Now, even before war was declared, the United States knew it was going to happen. So in the spring of 1812, Governor William Hall of Michigan Territory was called back to Washington, and he was asked to raise an army to invade Canada. And in the late spring of 1812, an army of 2,500 men marched north out of Dayton. A long march, a difficult march through the wilderness, through the swamps. They had to build their own bridges, make their own roads, until finally they reached their way up to Fort Detroit. Now, once Hall reached Fort Detroit, all he had to do was cross the Detroit River, work his way 18 miles south, surround Fort Malden, and wait for the British to surrender, because Hall's army outnumbered the British by over 3 to 1. Except it didn't quite happen that way, because through a series of incredible blunders and unbelievable stupidity, General William Hall ended up surrendering the entire Northwest Army without firing a shot. 2,500 men, 39 cannon, and a mountain of supplies. So here's a war that the United States declared. An invasion the United States initiated, and our whole army is wiped out in one fell swoop. Well, we're not about to give up. We're the United States. So another army was raised. And 5 months later, another battle was fought, this time at the River Raisin. Got ahead of myself. Present-day Monroe, Michigan. And there, of a small army of 934 American soldiers engaged, only 33 of them managed to escape. The rest were killed, wounded, or captured by the British. But it was also at the River Raisin where roughly 65 wounded American prisoners were massacred by the Indians. And this later gave rise to the cry, "Remember the River Raisin." It made Americans mad, and it made them willing to fight. Except that didn't help General William Henry Harrison, who just lost half of his army. So Harrison now had a choice. He could either retreat all the way back to Franklinton, present-day Columbus, Ohio, or he could build an advanced supply base up at the rapids of the Maumee River. And that's what he decided to do. And in the late winter months, 1813, Harrison builds a large 8-acre fort at the rapids of the Maumee, and it was named in honor of Ohio's governor, returned Jonathan Meigs. However, when the British found out about Fort Meigs, they decided to do something about it. And in late April of 1813, the British invaded the United States. Their squadron of warships sailed out of Fort Malden, down along the western end of the lake. They sailed up the Maumee River, and they unloaded their cannons, surrounded Fort Meigs, and opened fire. Now, the siege of Fort Meigs lasted 2 weeks. And during that 2-week time span, one pitched battle was fought. And of the 1,200 American soldiers engaged in that battle, less than half of them managed to work their way back into Fort Meigs. But 2 weeks long, the British were unable to crack the nut of that fort, and eventually they gave up and they retreated back into Canada. But in late April or late May, they tried it again. Once again, they sailed up the Maumee River. Once again, they laid siege to Fort Meigs. Once again, they were unsuccessful. But the British needed a victory. They had Indian allies. They had to have some sort of victory to assuage their Native American allies. So they looked for an easier target. And now they selected Fort Stephenson at present-day Fremont, Ohio. So the fleet sailed across the southern end of the lake, up Sandusky Bay, down the Sandusky River, and on the evening of July 31st, August 1st, they unloaded their guns and opened fire on tiny Fort Stephenson, only 1 acre in size, garrisoned by 160 Americans. The bombardment went on all day and then most of the next day. And then on the late afternoon of August 2nd, 1813, 400 regulars of the 41st Regiment of Foot made a bayonet assault against Fort Stephenson. And that assault was bloodily repulsed. The British now again retreated back into Canada. So as the situation now stood in the late summer of 1813, the United States had tried to invade Canada twice. They had failed. The British had tried to invade the United States twice. They had failed. There was one thing, one factor that was now going to determine the outcome of the war in the old Northwest Territory, and that was Lake Erie. Because in 1813, there's almost no roads in the neck of the woods. This is all wilderness. For an army to march from Erie, Pennsylvania, all the way up to Detroit, Michigan could take 2 to 3 weeks because of all of Northwest Ohio is one great big swamp, the Great Black Swamp. Difficult to move men and supplies. But by ship, if you did it by ship, you could cover that same distance in only 2 or 3 days. So whoever held naval control of Lake Erie had a tremendous advantage. The inland waterborne transportation route, the Great Lakes. You could move men and supplies back and forth easily, and you could pick and choose of where you were going to attack the soft underbelly of your enemy, because that's what the lakes were, and the Midwest, the soft underbelly of the other's country. So whoever held naval control of Lake Erie had a tremendous advantage. And at the outbreak of the War of 1812, Great Britain had 6 warships on Lake Erie. The United States had 1. And that one lone warship was captured at Detroit at the very beginning of the war. So for the whole first year of the War of 1812, Great Britain maintained naval control over Lake Erie. And that, of course, brings the Lake Erie Squadron into play. And the story of the Lake Erie fleet begins rather inauspiciously with a single man, a guy named Daniel Dobbins. Now, Daniel Dobbins was in command of a small merchant schooner on the Great Lakes. In July of 1813, he found himself at the wrong place at the wrong time. He was anchored in the bay at Fort Mackinac when it was surrendered to the British. And since Dobbins' vessel was anchored there, it was also included in the surrender terms. But the British were not able to take care of all the prisoners they captured up at Detroit, so up at Mackinac, what they did was they made Dobbins' vessel a cartel ship, or a truce ship. In other words, all the American prisoners are paroled. They sign a parole, say you will fight no more until you're properly exchanged. They were put on board Dobbins' vessel, and they sailed south. And Dobbins arrived at Detroit just in time to get embroiled in that ill-fated campaign. And Dobbins finds himself a prisoner of war for the second time. But he managed to escape from Detroit, made his way all the way back to Erie, Pennsylvania. From there, he was sent back to Washington, D.C. Now, Dobbins was the first man to inform the president and the cabinet of the disaster up at Detroit. And he convinced the president that the only way the United States was going to be able to compete for control of Lake Erie is if we had warships. The president agreed. Dobbins is commissioned a sailing master in the U.S. Navy and told to go build a fleet of warships. And to do that, the U.S. government gave him $2,000. Well, amazingly enough, Dobbins proceeds to follow his orders. And the first thing he had to do was find some place to build this squadron. And he selected Presque Isle Bay at Erie, Pennsylvania. And it was the perfect place for building ships, because Presque Isle Bay is protected by the Presque Isle Peninsula on the north and the northwest, and by the Pennsylvania mainland on the south. But what it had really going for it was there's this real narrow, winding channel entrance coming into the bay itself. So while the Americans are building their ships, if the British came down and tried to destroy them, which they later did, all the Americans had to do was put batteries on either side of that winding channel entrance, and they could keep the British out. So by late September of 1812, Dobbins starts building 4 small gunboats at Erie, Pennsylvania. And things went along fairly well until the last day of the year. And on that day, Erie received a special visitor. And that special visitor was Commodore Isaac Chauncey. Now, Isaac Chauncey was in overall command of Great Lakes Naval Operations. And spent one whole day visiting his command at Erie. But when he saw these 4 small gunboats, he knew they were not going to be big enough to fight the British for control of Lake Erie. So he now authorized Dobbins to build a larger warship, a 20-gun brig. And eventually this order is expanded to include 2 20-gun brigs. Seeing things are under control, he heads back to Sackett's Harbor up on New York, Lake Ontario. That was the base of Great Lakes Naval Operations. But on the way up, he had to do some thinking. He had this brand new squadron that was being built at Erie, but he didn't have anybody to command it. And the officers he then had on Lake Erie and Lake Ontario didn't have the training, didn't have the seniority, didn't have the experience. So this was on Chauncey's mind when he pulls into Sackett's Harbor. And when he gets into his desk, there's a letter waiting for him there. Chauncey needs a commander for this squadron, and 27-year-old Master Commandant Oliver Hazard Perry is yearning for just such an opportunity. Now, Oliver Hazard Perry went to sea at age 13 as a midshipman, a warranted midshipman. Served through the Quasi-War against France and the wars against the Barbary pirates, but he didn't really see a whole lot of action. By the time war is declared in 1812, Perry is in command of a small flotilla of gunboats at Newport, Rhode Island. Now, these gunboats were nothing but big rowboats with 1 or 2 cannons on it. This was Congress's idea of how we were going to fight the British Navy if we ever went to war. So this was not a very significant command. So Perry, knowing war was going to be declared like everybody else, wrote a letter to the Secretary of the Navy. He wants a command on one of the fast sloops of war or one of the armed gun brigs out on the Atlantic Ocean. But he was turned down. And in the meantime, war is declared. And again, Perry writes a letter to the Secretary of the Navy. And again, he is turned down. Not enough warships, too many officers. So Perry now is starting to get just a little bit nervous. Because here Perry sits at Newport, a backwater of the war, and all of his friends are out in the Atlantic Ocean on ships like the Constitution, the United States, the Wasp, the Hornet, the Frolic, the Essex, gaining that glory. Now, when I say glory, most men did not want to fight. But these young naval officers, most of them in their 20s or early 30s, the only way these guys were going to get promotion, get peer recognition, get the adulation of the country is by fighting ship-to-ship battles against the British and gaining victories. So these young naval officers were desperate to get into the battle, and Perry more so than any of them. And there he sat doing nothing, while all his friends are out there doing what he wanted to do. Until finally, he hears about this little squadron of gunboats being built up on the Great Lakes. So he writes a letter to his own acquaintance, Isaac Chauncey, and that was the letter that was waiting for him at Sackett's Harbor. When Chauncey saw it, he needed a commander, and Perry was accepted. But when you look at this, in the end result, Oliver Hazard Perry did not necessarily want to be at Lake Erie. It was his last desperate gamble to get into this war, get into the fighting, and to get that glory that men like Perry so desperately needed. And if he had to go to Lake Erie to do it, so be it. So Perry arrives at Erie, Pennsylvania in late March. And there he channels all of his energies into completing his new fleet, which if you stop to think about it, it's going to take a lot of effort because there's nothing at Erie, Pennsylvania to build ships with. Erie is just nothing but a little backwater town of only 400 residents. There's no industry up at Erie. The only thing they had lots of was wood. But to build a ship, you chop down a tree, you carve it up, and you let that wood cure for about a year. Except these men didn't have a year. So it was a nice live green tree one morning, might be part of a deck plank, a stanchion, or a yardarm that very afternoon. They didn't even have iron, speaking of the Iron Museum. They didn't even have iron for nails. They had to use wooden nails or tree nails to hold these ships together. Everything else had to be hauled in from outside. Canvas and cordage from Pittsburgh, powder from Philadelphia, guns from New York City and Washington, D.C., all hauled over horrible roads in one of the worst winters in memory. One of the miracles of the Battle of Lake Erie is not the fact that the United States won this battle. It's the fact that a fleet of 6 ships was built in the wilderness in a period of less than 8 months' time. For that feat alone, Oliver Hazard Perry and Daniel Dobbins deserve tremendous credit. So, by late July, Perry is ready to sail. He now has 11 vessels. Now, as I said, 6 ships were built at Erie, Pennsylvania, but he got 5 more gunboats from Black Rock, New York. Now, Black Rock is a small naval station on the northern outskirts of Buffalo. And what the United States did at the beginning of the war was buy up all the merchant ships on Lake Erie. And you take a merchant ship, you reinforce the deck planking, and you put a cannon or 2 on it, and you have a gunboat. Not much of a gunboat, but still you have a gunboat. So with these 5 additional ships, Perry had 11, and he's now ready to sail. With one great big problem facing him. He did not have enough men to man these ships. Now, Perry was in agreement with his superior, Isaac Chauncey, and the Secretary of the Navy that for these 11 ships, he needed a minimum, an absolute minimum of 740 men. And by mid-July, he had only 120 men fit for duty. Now, this was not a new problem. I mean, as early as May 9th, Perry sent a letter to Isaac Chauncey asking for reinforcements. Chauncey ignored him. 2 weeks later, Perry sent another letter up to Chauncey. Again, Chauncey ignored him. And it was about this time that Perry made a major blunder. He bypassed his immediate superior and wrote a letter directly to the Secretary of the Navy. Bypassed Chauncey. Of course, the Secretary of the Navy gets this letter and says, "Why is Perry writing to me?" So he writes to Chauncey up on Lake Ontario. And of course, when Chauncey saw that letter, he went ballistic. Perry went over his head. So he writes a nasty letter to Perry. And Perry writes a nasty letter back. He wasn't going to take anything from Chauncey. And pretty soon you have this acrimonious correspondence going back and forth on Lake Erie. But Perry got some help from an unexpected quarter, because it was about this time that William Henry Harrison out at Fort Meigs wrote a letter to the Secretary of War, because Harrison had been told, "You will not invade Canada again until we get control of Lake Erie." So here's Harrison writing to Perry asking for help, and Perry's telling him, "I can't come. I want to come out and help, but I don't have the men for my ships." So when Harrison writes to the Secretary of the War, he says, "You tell me this is an important command. I need naval control, and Perry doesn't have enough men. What's going on?" So the Secretary of War, of course, goes to the Secretary of the Navy. What's going on? And the Secretary of the Navy again writes Chauncey. It broke the logjam of seamen. About 125 men were sent down to Lake Erie. Still not enough, but also what Perry ended up with were the dregs of the Lake Ontario Squadron. Because let's say you are an officer on Lake Ontario, and you're ordered by your superior to send a bunch of men someplace else. Are you going to take the best men you have, all your most experienced trained men, or are you going to take those who are undisciplined, all those who are sick, all those who don't have the training? Yeah, well, that's what happened. So Perry ended up with the dregs of the Lake Ontario Squadron. So now he still needs men, but he's also getting more frustrated, and he sends off another nasty letter. And of course, it keeps up, and it got so bad that on August 10th, 1813, Oliver Hazard Perry resigned his command on Lake Erie. Well, in the meantime, he's still looking for men, and he did have one source right there next to him on land, because Governor Simon Snyder of Pennsylvania had been asked by the Secretary of War to send an entire regiment of Pennsylvania militia up to guard the ships as they were being built. So a provisional regiment from the counties in the central and southwestern part of the state were sent up to Erie. And Perry went among them and managed to get about 65 of them to join the U.S. Navy. And the Marine officer, Lieutenant John Brooks, got another 35 of them to join the U.S. Marine Corps. So now Perry has about 430, 440 men. He knows he's not getting any other reinforcements, so he decides to sail. Except there's that little matter of that resignation letter he sent in. Now Perry was dead serious about it, but he knew it was going to take several weeks for that letter to get to Washington, for any action to be taken, and for somebody to be sent back up to Erie. And Perry had gone to a tremendous amount of effort to build these ships, and a tremendous amount of effort to man these ships. And he was not going to pass up the opportunity to fight these ships. So even though that letter was sent in on August 10th, 2 days later, on August 12th, Perry hoisted up his anchors, pointed his bowsprits westward, and sailed for western Lake Erie. Now Perry rendezvoused with William Henry Harrison right out near Sandusky Bay. They got together, they plotted out the strategy and the tactics for the campaign. Harrison is the one who suggested Put-in Bay at South Bass Island to be the base for the American fleet. But just as importantly, when Harrison went back to the Army, he asks for volunteers from the Army. And another 130 men from the Northwest Army volunteer to serve on board Perry's squadron. So what you now have in the end result of the roughly 570 men who fought on board the American squadron in the Battle of Lake Erie, more than 40% of them were not trained seamen. They were soldiers and Marines from more than 20 different military units in the Lake Erie and Lake Ontario regions. An incredible amalgamation of men who never before and never since joined together to fight a fleet of U.S. warships. So now with those final reinforcements, Perry sails out to Put-in Bay, which he made his base. Now, over the next 2 weeks, he made 2 reconnaissance cruises up to the mouth of the Detroit River, but he decided not to make a direct attack. Because Fort Malden is too well defended, the current of the Detroit River is too swift, the channel's too narrow, and the winds are too fickle. And besides, Perry did not have to risk his fleet attacking well-defended Fort Malden. All Perry had to do was sail back to Put-in Bay, drop his anchors, train his crews, and wait. Because as long as Perry is sitting at Put-in Bay, the next move is going to be up to the British. Now the British fleet is commanded by Robert Harriet Barclay, a Scotsman who was actually a year younger than Perry. Barclay went to sea at age 12, and in 1805 he was a junior lieutenant on board the 74-gun HMS Swiftsure. And there he participated in Lord Nelson's fleet on board or during the cataclysmic Battle of Trafalgar. And then 2 years later, in a cutting out expedition, Barclay lost his left arm fighting against the French. But the British, even though Barclay was now an invalid, the British needed every trained, experienced officer they had, because the British were fighting for their very lives against Napoleon. So even though he was an invalid, he's called back to duty and sent to North America. He served on the Atlantic Ocean for about a year and a half, but then at the beginning of the War of 1812, he's sent to Lake Ontario, and eventually he's ordered out to Lake Erie. Now Barclay also did not want to be on Lake Erie. In fact, he's ordered to go there after another British officer, Captain James Mulcaster, declined the command, saying, "There is no glory to be gained on Lake Erie." But there is one thing that Barclay did have. A brand new flagship, the 19-gun HMS Detroit, just completed at the Amherstburg Navy Yard. But supplies and materials of every sort simply were not available, because Fort Malden is at the end of a 5,000-mile-long supply line. Everything the British used, except for wood, came all the way from England. I mean, even the guns that were supposed to line her broadsides had been captured by the Americans on Lake Ontario. So what the British had to do was strip Fort Malden of its heavy guns to put on board the Detroit. But normally what you want on a ship of war is all one heavy broadside of, say, 24-pounders. And when I say 24-pounder, all that means is the cannon fired a 24-pound cannonball. Guns in those days were classified by the weight of the cannonballs they fired. But Fort Malden didn't have that many 24-pounders. So what Barclay ended up with on the Detroit, 2 24-pounders, 2 18-pounders, several 12-pounders, even smaller 9-pounders and 6-pounders, all of which took different sizes of ammunition, all of which were going to cause Barclay problems later during the battle. And Barclay was also desperately short of men. His superior on Lake Ontario, Sir James Lucas Yeo, was just as parsimonious with men and resources as Chauncey was. So Barclay's fleet is manned mostly by soldiers of the 41st Regiment of Foot, the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, and the Provincial Marine, which is actually an Army transportation service. But the biggest problem for the British, their biggest problem was Fort Malden itself. Because in addition to the British Army, in addition to the British Navy, there are 14,000 Indians camped around Fort Malden. Of course, the Indians are allies to the British, and the Native American allies gathered from all over the Northwest Territory. And there's not too many supermarkets up there for the other families to rely on, so the Native Americans brought their families with them. And the very least the British had to do to maintain the loyalty of the Indians is to feed them. And 14,000 mouths, that takes one heck of a lot of food. And here was where the British problem was. Because between Fort Malden, there was only one very narrow road that went up the Sandwich, present day, I just forgot. Anyhow, one very narrow road that went all the way over to the western end of Lake Ontario, present day Windsor, Ontario. A narrow dirt mud road that no way was large enough to supply all the needs of Fort Malden. And the only way the British could get sufficient supplies if their supply ships sailed around Point Pelee to the eastern end of the lake, around Long Point to Port Dover, which was a small British naval supply base. However, Perry is now sitting right here at Put in Bay. And if the British supply ships sailed, all Perry had to do was move up 15 miles into the Pelee Passage, wait for those supply ships to come back, and capture them. So as long as Perry is sitting at Put in Bay, the British supply line is severed. So the British now, by September 9th, were down to 1 day supply of flour. They faced a very cruel choice. They could either burn Fort Malden, abandon the entire Northwest, or the British fleet could sail down, defeat the American fleet, and reopen their supply line. And that's why the Battle of Lake Erie was fought. So even though Barclay knew his men were not trained, his ships were not ready, he had no choice. He was given his orders. On the afternoon of September 9th, 1813, with 6 vessels, Barclay hoists up his anchors, floats down into western Lake Erie. Now the British were spotted at dawn the morning of September 10th, and Perry, with 9 vessels, sails out to fight. Now he started out with 11, but one of those, the schooner Amelia, he couldn't even man it. He left it back at Erie. And another one, the schooner Ohio, had been sent back to Erie for supplies. Ironically, the Ohio was commanded by Daniel Dobbins. So the man who had so much to do with getting that fleet built eventually missed the actual battle. But in any case, Perry with 9 ships goes out to fight. Now there's 2 things you have to take into consideration when you talk about any naval battle of this time frame. And the first are the guns that were used. And the British fleet were armed with long guns. That's your standard naval cannon of the day, which can fire a cannonball roughly 1 mile, accurately to about a half a mile. But Perry used something different. Perry's fleet was armed principally with carronades. Now the carronade is a unique naval weapon invented at about the time of the Revolutionary War. And it had a lot of advantages over the traditional long gun. Now if you look at the comparison down here at the bottom, this gray shaded one is a 32-pound long gun. Now the barrel alone of a 32-pound long gun can be 9 feet long, called a long 9 or a long tom, and it can weigh 6,000 pounds. Now if you have a big ship, it doesn't matter how much weight you put on it, but if you take a smaller warship, a schooner or a brig, and you put a lot of weight up high in that gun deck, it's going to affect the center of gravity. That ship can roll over. So before the Revolutionary War, if you had a small warship, you could either put 1 or 2 big guns on it or a lot of small guns. You didn't have any options. But then along came the carronade. And notice how long that barrel is. That's a 32-pounder. And that barrel is not 9 feet long. It's only about 5 feet long. And it doesn't weigh 9,000 pounds. It weighs only, or 6,000, it weighs 2,000 pounds. So now by using carronades, a captain could literally triple his firepower by using these stubby, lightweight carronades. And it had a number of other advantages. It used a lot less powder. And because he used a lot less powder and the barrel was so short, you could load it and fire it twice as fast. And because you could do that, it took a lot fewer men to operate. So a lot of good things about this gun. And one not so good thing about this gun. Because that barrel was so short and because it used a lot less powder, it had less than half the range of a long gun. Point blank, only 330 yards. And that brings the second factor into play, and that's the wind. Now, the two largest ships on each squadron were square-rigged sailing vessels. Now, when I say square-rigger, it does not mean it's because the sails are square. It's because the yards are perpendicular or square to the mast. Yeah, it doesn't make any sense to me either, but that's the way they figured it out. But in any case, a square-rigger could not sail directly into the wind, or within an arc of roughly 120 degrees of the wind's direction. They had to have the wind behind them. So what all this boils down to, if the British had the weather gauge, if they had the wind behind them, they could sit 1/2 mile away, pound Perry's fleet into submission one by one, and Perry would never even get within range for his carronade. So it's absolutely crucial. The Americans had to have the wind behind them. And when Perry sailed out of Put-in-Bay Harbor, he left the harbor and he's moving to the west-northwest. The wind is blowing from the west-southwest, almost directly in Perry's face. For the next 3 hours, Perry zigzags, tacking back and forth. What he's trying to do by zigzagging is to get to the west of Rattlesnake Island. If he could get out in this direction, he could turn north and he could have the wind behind him. But while he's making some progress by tacking back and forth, his two biggest ships, the Lawrence and the Niagara, were shallow draft vessels. So the wind, which is pressing against him, is also pushing him sideways. So basically he's going forward and backwards at the same time. Essentially, he's going nowhere fast. 3 long, anxious hours he paced back and forth on the quarterdeck of the Lawrence until finally, at 10 o'clock, Perry gave up. He gave the order to turn around and head the other direction. But miraculously, even before that order could be executed, the wind suddenly backed around 90 degrees and blew out of the southeast, directly behind the American fleet. So the most critical factor in the Battle of Lake Erie was not men, not guns, not ships, not commanders, good old Mother Nature and the wind. And just when the United States needed it, the wind shifted 90 degrees and gave Perry the critical advantage he needed. So with the wind behind him, he now sails out to fight. Now this was the first time that Perry had an opportunity to see the entire British battle line, because before they were sailing straight at him and he couldn't see the entire line. But now when the wind shifted, the British turned their ships to the westward, hove to, and formed up in line of battle. And Perry now made a few adjustments in his own battle plan. He placed 2 small schooners, the Scorpion and Ariel, up front. They would fight the first British vessel. Third in line came the Lawrence, a 20-gun brig. That was Perry's flagship. Now, a point I would like to clarify. Perry's actual rank was that of Master Commandant. That was a rank unique to the United States Navy. A lot of you probably saw the movie Master and Commander. Well, it's a combination of those 2 ranks, Master Commandant. It's the same rank as a commander in the British Navy. But because Perry is in command of the Lawrence, he's a commander of a ship, so he's entitled to the rank of captain. But also, he's in command of an entire squadron. So because of that, he's entitled to the rank of Commodore. So, Master Commandant, Captain, Commodore, all 3 are accurate. One thing Perry never was is an admiral. The rank of admiral was not instituted in the U.S. Navy until 1862. However, as a Commodore, he had the same privileges as an admiral. In other words, flag rank. He could carry his own battle flag. And whatever ship he chose as his command ship, that was the flagship. So Perry chose the 20-gun brig Lawrence to be his flagship. The Lawrence would fight the Detroit, Barclay's flagship with 19 guns. Now, 4th in line came the Caledonia. She was a small brig, only carried 3 guns. But then 5th in line came the Niagara. The Niagara was a sister ship of the Lawrence, another 20-gun brig, under the command of Master Commandant Jesse Elliott. The Niagara would go up against the Queen Charlotte, the second largest British ship of 17 guns. And then last came the smaller schooners and sloop. They would fight the smaller British vessels. So, Perry has 9 ships, the British have 6. the Americans outnumber the British. Well, not quite, because the British with 6 ships have 63 guns. The Americans with 9 ships only have 54 guns. So the British outnumber the Americans. Well, again, not quite, because it wasn't the number of ships, it wasn't the number of guns that really mattered. What counted here was weight of broadsides, and I'll simplify that for you. Let's take the Lawrence. Say she has 20 guns, and all 10 of them on each side, all of them fire broadside. All 10 guns fire at the same time, and they're all 32-pounders. A broadside weight of 320 pounds. And then take the Detroit. Let's say she has 10 guns per side, but they're only 12-pounders. A broadside weight of 120 pounds. You can see the difference. This is one of those situations where bigger is definitely better. A cannonball the size of a bowling ball is going to create a lot more damage than a cannonball the size of a softball. So of Perry's 54 guns, 40 of them were on 2 ships, the Lawrence and Niagara. And of those 40, 36 of them are heavy 32-pounder carronades. Now the largest guns the British had were 24-pounders. They didn't have that many of them. So what this boils down to is that if Perry could get the Lawrence up against the Detroit in close action and get the Niagara in close action against the Queen Charlotte, Perry would have better than a 2-to-1 firepower advantage over the British in weight of broadsides. The smaller ships were not going to play a major role in this battle. Both commanders knew that. All Perry had to do was get those 2 large ships together and he would have that tremendous advantage. And now just before the battle opened, Perry raises his battle flag to the topmast of the Lawrence, a large blue banner with the crudely inscribed words, "Don't give up the ship." Now a lot of people attribute these words to Oliver Hazard Perry, but they were not his. These were actually the dying words of a friend of Perry's, Captain James Lawrence. On June 1st, 1813, Lawrence sailed out of Boston Harbor in a frigate called the Chesapeake and went out to fight a British frigate called the Shannon. And early on in that battle, Lawrence was hit in the lower stomach by a musket ball. Carried below deck in horrible pain, he kept uttering over and over again, "Don't give up the ship. Fight her till she sinks. Blow her up. Don't give up the ship." Well, sadly enough, Lawrence's men did give up the ship. In fact, they gave it up in record time, less than 15 minutes. The battle between the Chesapeake and the Shannon is one of the most horrible battles in all of American naval history. Just deplorable on how badly it went. But despite that fact, Perry's flagship was named after his dead friend, James Lawrence, and Perry picked his dead friend's dying words, "Don't give up the ship," to be his battle slogan. And if nothing else, it clearly indicated his determination to win the coming battle. And now the wind was behind him, he's sailing out. But the wind is blowing very, very lightly. It's going to take another hour for these 2 fleets to close within range. And many people often say that the waiting part of a battle is the worst part. Now, for a lot of these men, some of them actually, a few of them had been in naval battles before. They came from the East Coast, they'd served on the Constitution and other ships. But most of them were green. They were blithely ignorant. They did not have a clue. But these experienced men knew that a naval battle held more horror and more terror than any land battle ever could. Because it wasn't just cannonballs that they were afraid of. They were afraid of wood splinters. Because when a cannonball punches through the side of a ship, it shatters the bulwarks, and dozens of wood splinters, anywhere from the size of a spear to that of a thumbnail, would scour the deck. They're afraid of being raked, where one ship crosses in front of the other or behind the other. It's called crossing. It's the classic naval maneuver. The ship that crosses the T can fire every one of its guns, and the ship that gets crossed can't answer back. And a single cannonball can carry down the entire length of a gun deck packed full of men carrying death and destruction all the way. They're afraid of other things that can be fired out of cannons, not just solid iron cannonballs, also chain shot and bar shot. It's called disabling shot because it's fired at long range before they close in. Now, chain shot is 2 cannonballs hooked together by a length of chain, whereas bar shot looks like a large dumbbell or a doorknob fired out of a cannon, it spins through the air, and it's used to knock down the masts, the sails, and the rigging. You knock your enemy's mast down, he's helpless. You can capture him very easily. When you get into close range, you use anti-personnel rounds like grape shot and canister shot. Grape shot gets its name because it looks like a bundle of grapes, but it's actually, for a 32-pounder, it's 9 3-pound cannonballs. 3 3-pound shot in each tier with a big iron disc at the bottom and a big iron bolt going through the middle. And canister is nothing but a tin can filled full of about 27 1-pound iron balls. What canister and grape shot do is turn a cannon into a giant shotgun, devastating against personnel. And then there was something called langrage, or langrage, a homemade round that Perry, being out here in the wilderness, used a lot of. And to make langrage, you take a piece of canvas and sew it up into a pocket. And you fill that pocket of canvas full of nuts and bolts, broken glass, scrap iron, pieces of broken pottery, anything you can find. Tie it up, ram it down a cannon, and fire it out. Again, devastating against personnel. These men were afraid of yards, rigging, sails, masts, all of which could be knocked down from above. They're worried about cannons being hit and turned over, all of which could crush and maim. They're worried about boarding actions, where one ship would ram up against the other ship, and they would board it and try to capture it in hand-to-hand fighting. And then you'd have the personal bloodletting with muskets and bayonets and pistols and cutlasses and boarding pikes and boarding axes and belaying pins, even hands, feet, and teeth if necessary. But what really bothered these men, what they were really terrified of, was being wounded and sent down to the dank horror of the orlop deck, where the surgeon waited with his bone saws, scalpels, probes, lancets, and a seaman had nothing for an anesthetic but a shot of whiskey and a big piece of leather to bite on to choke off his screams. A phrase you often read in naval fiction, something to the effect, the men eagerly awaited the coming battle. Yeah, don't you believe it? Except for a few